The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal spires of Nexus Prime as students from across the galaxy hurried to their classes. The Galactic Military Academy stood like a monument to unity, its halls filled with beings from dozens of worlds, all working toward the same goal of understanding warfare and peace. Jiwan adjusted her datapad as she walked into Professor Veltar's classroom. She was proud of her reputation as one of the brightest Centauri students in her year. Her blue-tinted skin gleamed under the artificial lights, and her large eyes scanned the room with the confidence of someone who always had the right answers. She took her usual seat in the front row, ready to absorb whatever knowledge the day would bring. Minho entered next, his tall Corallian frame making other students look small by comparison. His species were known throughout the galaxy as natural warriors, and he wore that heritage like a badge of honor. The bone ridges along his forehead caught the light as he nodded to Jiwan and took the seat beside her. His people had never lost a war, and he made sure everyone knew it. Hiren slipped in quietly, as was her way. The Vestan student preferred to observe rather than speak, her pale features and silver hair making her appear almost ghost-like among her more colorful classmates. She carried herself with the careful grace of someone who studied minds rather than weapons, always watching, always learning about the beings around her. Deho burst through the door just as the warning chime sounded, his heavy Vrex boots thundering against the floor. His rocky, mineral-based skin sparked slightly as he moved, a sign of his excitement. As an engineer, he loved nothing more than discussing the technical aspects of warfare, especially when he could point out the flaws in other species' designs. Professor Veltar entered the classroom with the slow, measured steps of someone who had seen centuries pass. His species was ancient, their long limbs and weathered features speaking of wisdom earned through experience. He had taught at the academy for longer than most students had been alive, and his classes on historical military disasters were both feared and respected. "Today," Professor Veltar announced, his voice carrying easily through the silent room, "we begin our study of military failures that changed the course of galactic history. Please open your text to Chapter 47. The students activated their datapads, and pages of text and images flickered to life. Jiwan scrolled through quickly, her sharp mind already categorizing the information. She saw the usual suspects: the hegemony's failed invasion of the core worlds, the Merchant Guild's disastrous attempt at military expansion, and various other conflicts where pride had led to downfall. But then something caught Minho's attention. He pointed to a small entry near the bottom of the page, his thick finger tapping against the screen. "Professor, what's this about a human combat ban? I've never heard of humans being involved in any major conflicts." Professor Veltar paused. In his preparation, his ancient eyes focusing on Minho with an expression that was hard to read. Yes. The human combat ban of 2387. What does your text say about it?" Vivan read aloud, her voice filled with barely contained amusement. "Following excessive collateral damage and numerous treaty violations during the Outer Rim conflicts, human military forces were restricted to non-combat support roles by Council Resolution 2387 Alpha." She looked up with a smile. "They got banned from fighting? How incompetent do you have to be for the entire galaxy to tell you to stop trying?" The classroom erupted in laughter. Deho's rocky form shook with mirth, small sparks flying from his skin. "I've seen human technology. It's primitive compared to ours. No wonder they couldn't fight properly." Hiren frowned slightly, her analytical mind picking up on something that bothered her. But why would the council bother with a formal ban? Usually incompetent forces just ... fade away naturally. Maybe they were so bad they were getting in everyone else's way, Minho suggested, his warrior's pride making him dismissive of any species that couldn't handle combat. "My people have been fighting for thousands of years. We've never needed a ban to keep us from embarrassing ourselves." Jiwan pulled up additional information on her datapad, her curiosity piqued despite her amusement. "It says here that humans were only involved in 3 major conflicts before the ban: the Kepler Station incident, the Asteroid Belt campaign, and something called the Last Stand at Proxima Gate 3 conflicts and they got banned. That has to be some kind of record. 3 conflicts? Deho laughed so hard that small pebbles fell from his rocky exterior. My species has been in hundreds of wars. These humans must have really messed up to get kicked out after just 3 tries. Professor Veltar watched the students' reactions carefully, making notes on his own datapad. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his ancient eyes that suggested deeper knowledge. And what do you think this tells us about human military capabilities? That they don't have any, Jiwan replied quickly, earning more laughter from her classmates. I mean, look at the evidence. 3 conflicts, banned from combat, relegated to support roles. They're probably good at fixing things or carrying supplies, but actual fighting? Clearly not their strength, Minho nodded in agreement. In Corallian culture, we have a saying, a warrior who cannot fight is no warrior at all. Humans must be a very peaceful species by nature. There's no shame in that, but they shouldn't pretend to be something they're not. Hiren raised her hand tentatively. Professor, are there more details about these conflicts? The entry seems very brief for something significant enough to warrant a galactic ban. Professor Veltar's pause stretched longer than usual. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made several students straighten in their seats. The detailed records are classified, available only to senior military historians and council members. What you see in your text is the official summary. Classified? Deho's sparks grew brighter with excitement. Why would records of military failures be classified? Usually the council wants everyone to learn from mistakes. Perhaps, the professor said slowly, because not all military actions that end in restrictions are necessarily failures. The statement hung in the air, causing a moment of confusion among the students. Jiwan was the first to recover, her analytical mind rejecting the implication. But professor, if they weren't failures, why would humans be banned? The only logical explanation is that they were so bad at warfare that they became a liability. Logic, Professor Veltar observed, is not always as simple as it appears, but please continue with your analysis. What else does the text tell you about human military involvement? Minho scrolled through more information. It says here that multiple species filed formal complaints about human forces during these conflicts. The Rigelian Empire, the Centauri Federation, even the normally peaceful Aldebaran Collective all requested that human military units be removed from their operational areas. See? Yuan said triumphantly. Even their allies didn't want to work with them. That's the definition of military incompetence. Hiren, however, was reading more carefully. But it doesn't say the complaints were about incompetence. It just says they requested removal. The reasons aren't specified. What other reason could there be? Deho asked, his engineering mind appreciating clear cause and effect. If someone asks you to remove a military unit, it's because that unit isn't performing well. Professor Veltar made another note, his expression unreadable. That is certainly one possible interpretation. Are there others? The students looked at each other, but none could think of alternative explanations that made sense. In their experience, military forces were judged by their effectiveness, and ineffective forces were quietly reassigned or disbanded. A formal galactic ban seemed like overkill for simple incompetence, but what else could explain it? Maybe, Jiwan suggested, humans are just too emotional for warfare. Some species aren't built for the psychological pressures of combat. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations. That would make sense, Minho agreed. Warfare requires discipline, strategy, and the ability to think clearly under pressure. If humans get too emotional, they would make poor soldiers. As the class period drew to a close, Professor Veltar assigned their semester project. Choose any military disaster or significant conflict from galactic history. Research it thoroughly. Analyze the factors that led to failure or success, and present your findings to the class. You have 8 weeks. Jiwan looked at her friends with a grin that promised mischief. I think we just found our topic. The human combat ban would make a perfect case study in military incompetence. Easy research, obvious conclusions, and probably good for some laughs along the way. Deho's sparks danced with enthusiasm. I love it. We can examine their equipment failures, tactical mistakes, and diplomatic blunders. It'll be like a textbook. Example of how not to conduct warfare. Minho cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing off his bone ridges. My people have extensive military archives. I can probably find some first-hand accounts of working with human forces, assuming anyone was willing to admit to it. Hiren was quieter, but she nodded along with the group's enthusiasm. Deep in her mind, however, something nagged at her. The professor's reactions had been ... unusual, and the way he had phrased his questions suggested there might be more to the saint. The library at the Galactic Military Academy was a marvel of engineering and knowledge. Thousands of data terminals lined the walls, each one connected to archives spanning centuries of galactic history. Students from dozens of species worked quietly at their stations, researching everything from ancient battle tactics to modern diplomatic solutions. G1 sat at the largest terminal their group could find, her blue fingers dancing across the holographic interface with practiced ease. The other three gathered around her, each holding their own data pads to take notes. They had been working for 3 days now, and their confidence in their chosen topic grew stronger with each piece of evidence they found. Look at this, Jiwan sighed, pulling up a military assessment report. The Regelian Empire's official statement about the Kepler Station incident. They describe human forces as unpredictable and difficult to coordinate with. That's diplomatic language for completely useless. Minho leaned over her shoulder, his bone ridges casting shadows on the screen. Here's another one from the Centauri Federation. They say human soldiers showed concerning disregard for established military protocols. Protocol exists for a reason. You can't just ignore centuries of proven tactics. Deho was examining technical specifications on his own pad, small sparks of excitement flickering across his rocky skin. Their equipment is even worse than I thought. Look at these weapon designs, they're incredibly crude. Most of their firearms use chemical propulsion instead of energy projection. It's like they're still living in the Stone Age. Hiren had been quietly reading psychological profiles, her silver hair falling across her face as she concentrated. The personality assessments are interesting, she said softly. Multiple reports mention that humans have excessive emotional responses during combat situations. The Aldebaran collective psychologists recommended that human soldiers undergo extensive therapy before being allowed near any conflict zone. Excessive emotional responses, Jawan repeated with a laugh. That explains everything. You can't fight a war if you're too busy crying or getting angry. Modern warfare requires cool heads and logical thinking. They continued their research, building what they believed was an airtight case. Every document seemed to support their theory that humans were simply not suited for military service. The evidence was overwhelming, or so they thought, Minho found. Records showing that human forces had been present at only 3 major conflicts in galactic history before the ban was implemented. 3 conflicts in over 200 years of galactic membership, he noted. Most warrior species participate in dozens of conflicts during that time period. Humans barely tried. Maybe they knew they were bad at it, Deho suggested, his engineering mind appreciating practical limitations. Smart species recognize their weaknesses and focus on their strengths. There's nothing wrong with being support personnel instead of frontline fighters. Jiwan pulled up casualty reports from the 3 conflicts, scanning them quickly. The numbers are strange, though. Human losses were surprisingly low for such an incompetent force. You'd expect them to suffer heavy casualties if they were really as bad as these reports suggest. Probably because they stayed in the back, Minho said dismissively. Support units typically have lower casualty rates than combat forces. It makes sense that humans would have fewer losses if they weren't actually doing any real fighting. Hiren was reading more detailed psychological evaluations, her trained mind picking up on subtle details that others might miss. Some of these assessments are unusual. Listen to this quote from a Centauri field commander. Human forces displayed unnatural persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. Recommend immediate psychological evaluation and possible medical intervention. Unnatural persistence, Deho repeated thoughtfully. That could mean they were too stubborn to retreat when they should have. Knowing when to withdraw is an important part of military strategy. Exactly, Jawan agreed. They probably got their allies into trouble by refusing to follow sensible tactical decisions. No wonder everyone wanted them removed from the battlefield. The group spent hours compiling their evidence, creating detailed charts and graphs that showed human military inadequacy from every angle. They compared human technology to that of successful military species, analyzed casualty ratios, and documented the numerous complaints filed by other civilizations. But as they worked, Hiram began to notice something that bothered her. Many of the official reports had large sections that were blacked out or marked as classified. When she mentioned this to her friends, they had ready explanations. Probably embarrassing details about human failures, Jawan suggested. The council might have classified the worst parts to avoid completely humiliating humanity. Or maybe they're protecting sensitive information about other species' military capabilities, Minho added. Just because parts are classified doesn't mean they're hiding anything important about humans specifically. Deho nodded in agreement. Classification is standard procedure for any military documents. The fact that some information is restricted doesn't change the clear pattern we're seeing. Their research continued for another week. They found testimonials from various species requesting that human forces be removed from joint operations. They discovered technical reports criticizing human equipment as unsuitable for civilized warfare. They even located training manuals that had been rewritten after human participation, with new sections on managing unpredictable allied behavior. This is perfect, Jawan said as she compiled their final research summary. We have documentation from multiple sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. Humans were banned from combat because they were a liability to themselves and everyone around them. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Human technology was primitive. Their tactics were criticized by professional military analysts. Their psychological profiles suggested they were unsuited for the mental demands of warfare. Multiple allied species had formally requested their removal from combat zones. Minho was particularly pleased with a document he had found in his people's military archives. This is a Corallian general's personal assessment of human forces during the Asteroid Belt campaign. He writes, "Human units require constant supervision and are prone to actions that endanger mission success. Recommend immediate reassignment to non-critical support roles." A Corallian general, Deho said with admiration, "Your people are the best warriors in the galaxy." If a Corallian military leader says humans are incompetent, that's about as authoritative as you can get. As their presentation date approached, the group felt increasingly confident about their project. They had 8 weeks of research supporting their thesis, documentation from multiple reliable sources, and a clear narrative that explained why humans had been banned from combat operations. Hiram was the only one who still felt uneasy about some of the details, but she couldn't articulate exactly what bothered her. The classified sections in the reports nagged at her, and some of the language used in the psychological evaluations seemed strange for simple incompetence assessments. Professor Veltar seemed hesitant when we first mentioned this topic, she said during one of their preparation sessions. Maybe we should ask him for guidance on our research direction. He's probably just surprised that we found such an obvious example of military failure, Jawan replied confidently. Some professors prefer more complex topics for student projects, but there's nothing wrong with choosing something straightforward. The next day, Professor Veltar did approach them privately after class. His ancient features were thoughtful as he spoke, and his voice carried a weight that made them all pay attention. "I understand you've chosen the human combat ban as your research topic," he said slowly. "Are you certain this is the direction you want to pursue?" "Absolutely," Minho replied with enthusiasm. "We found extensive documentation supporting our analysis. It's a clear case of military incompetence leading to necessary restrictions. Professor Valtar's pause stretched longer than usual. When he spoke again, his words were careful and measured. Some stones are better left unturned. History is not always as simple as it appears in official summaries. The students exchanged glances, interpreting this as their professor's concern about the obviousness of their chosen topic. Juan spoke for the group with respectful confidence. "We appreciate your concern, Professor, but we've done thorough research. The evidence all points in the same direction. We're confident in our analysis and conclusions." "Very well," Professor Valtar said quietly. "But remember what I told you about history being written by survivors. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that aren't recorded in official documents." After he left, Deho sparked with excitement. "I think he's worried we've made it too easy for ourselves. Maybe he wants us to dig deeper into the technical aspects of human military failures. Or he's concerned that we're being too harsh in our assessment," Hiren suggested. "Maybe he wants us to show more diplomatic sensitivity when discussing human limitations." "Either way," Jiwan concluded, "we have solid research and clear conclusions. Our presentation is going to be excellent." They spent the remaining time polishing their presentation, creating visual displays that showed human military inadequacy through charts, graphs. The Academy's medical library was quieter than the main research facility, with fewer students and more specialized databases. Hiren sat alone at a corner terminal, her silver hair catching the soft blue light from the screen. 3 days remained until their presentation, and while her friends were busy preparing their visual displays and practicing their speeches, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with their research. The classified sections in the military reports bothered her more each day. As a xenopsychology student, she had access to medical and psychological databases that weren't available to general military history students. She had decided to use her credentials to look deeper into the human conflicts, hoping to find additional psychological evidence to support their thesis. What she found instead made her stomach turn cold. The first document she accessed was a medical report from the Shepler Station incident. It was heavily redacted with large sections blacked out, but what remained visible painted a picture that didn't match anything her group had discussed. The casualty numbers were there, clear and undeniable. Human forces, 847 soldiers deployed. Casualties, 23 killed, 156 wounded. Allied forces, 12,000 soldiers from various species. Casualties, 89 killed, 234 wounded. Enemy forces, 45,000 soldiers, multiple species coalition. Casualties, 18,000 killed, 22,000 wounded. 5,000 missing or deserted. Hiren stared at the numbers, reading them 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. The humans had been outnumbered more than 50 to 1, yet they had the lowest casualty rate of anyone involved in the conflict. The enemy forces had suffered casualties at a rate that seemed impossible. She pulled up the next document, a psychological evaluation of survivors from the Asteroid Belt campaign. The text was clinical and cold, but the implications were terrifying. Subject 2847B, Regelian Empire naval officer, exhibits severe post-traumatic stress following engagement with human forces. Patient reports recurring nightmares about humans who wouldn't die and the sound of human laughter during artillery bombardment. Recommend immediate psychiatric care and permanent reassignment away from any operations involving human personnel. Another evaluation caught her attention. Subject 3921C, Centauri Federation Marine, displays symptoms consistent with acute psychological break. Patient repeatedly states that humans fight like demons, and they kept coming even when they should have been dead. Multiple accounts describe human soldiers continuing to fight with wounds that would incapacitate most species. Recommend extended therapy and possible memory modification. Hiren's hands trembled as she scrolled through more reports. Every psychological evaluation told the same story. Soldiers from dozens of different species, all describing human forces in terms that suggested something far more disturbing than simple incompetence. She found a communication log from the last stand at Proxima Gate transmitted by a Corellian fleet commander to his home base. The message was brief but chilling. Request immediate recall of human ground forces. Situation no longer tactically sound. Enemy surrendering faster than we can process prisoners. Human forces showing no signs of fatigue after 96 hours continuous combat. Several allied species requesting transfer away from human operational area. This is not normal warfare. The pieces of a horrible puzzle began forming in Hiren's mind. She pulled up technical reports about human equipment, reading them with new understanding. The descriptions of human weapons as crude and unsuitable for civilized warfare took on different meanings. When she considered the casualty reports she had just seen, one engineering assessment noted, human projectile weapons cause significantly more psychological trauma than standard energy weapons. The physical nature of ballistic impact appears to have profound effects on enemy morale. Several species have reported that the sound of human gunfire alone causes panic in their troops. Another technical report caught her eye. Human soldiers display unusual equipment preferences, often carrying what they call backup weapons, including bladed implements and chemical explosive devices. When questioned, human personnel explain that these are for when the real weapons run out. This suggests a level of combat persistence that exceeds normal military doctrine. Hiren realized with growing horror that every piece of evidence her group had interpreted as proof of human incompetence could be read in a completely different way. The complaints from allied species weren't about humans being useless. They were about humans being too effective in ways that disturbed everyone around them. She accessed her group's shared research files and began cross-referencing their findings with the medical reports she was reading. The pattern became clear and terrifying. Every time their research mentioned humans being removed from operational areas, it was accompanied by requests for psychological support for non-human personnel. A diplomatic message from the Aldebaran Collective made her blood run cold. While we appreciate human military assistance, we must formally request their withdrawal from our space. Our civilian population has begun experiencing mass panic attacks simply from knowing human soldiers are present on nearby worlds. The psychological impact of their reputation is affecting our society's stability. The reputation. What reputation? Could human soldiers have earned that would cause an entire species to panic just from their presence? She found part of the answer in a classified intelligence report. Human forces have achieved 100% mission success rate across all 3 major conflicts. No human unit has ever retreated or surrendered, even when facing overwhelming odds. Enemy forces report that human soldiers continue fighting until physically incapable of movement. Several opposing commanders have requested information about human pain tolerance and survival mechanisms, believing humans may be using unknown medical enhancement technology. Hiren felt sick. Her friends had spent weeks building a case about human military incompetence, but the real documents painted a picture of something far more disturbing. Humans weren't banned for being bad at warfare. They were banned for being too good at it in ways that traumatized every species they encountered. She tried to access more detailed battle reports, but most were classified beyond her clearance level. What she could see, however, was enough to shatter every assumption her group had made. The phrases that appeared repeatedly in the available documents created a terrifying pattern. Unnatural persistence in the face of certain death. Complete disregard for personal safety. Continued fighting with injuries that should have been incapacitating. Psychological impact on Allied forces nearly as severe as on enemy forces. Recommend immediate psychological evaluation for all personnel who worked with human units. The medical reports contained details that made her understand why so much was classified. Descriptions of human soldiers fighting for days without sleep, using their own bodies as shields for allies, and displaying pain tolerance that military doctors described as biologically impossible. For most known species, one report from a field medic stood out. Treated human soldier with injuries that would have killed any member of my species. Patient. Remained conscious and continued giving tactical advice while undergoing surgery. When informed that his injuries would end his military career, Patient asked only when he could return to active duty. This level of dedication to combat goes beyond training or duty. It appears to be something fundamental to human psychology. Hiron realized that Professor Veltar's warnings had been more serious than any of them understood. The old professor had been trying to protect them from knowledge that could change their entire understanding of humans and warfare itself. She thought about the human students at the academy. They were all from something called the Diplomatic Corps, always friendly and helpful, focused on peaceful cooperation and cultural exchange. She had never seen a human military officer or soldier. Now she understood why the real human warriors were somewhere else, banned from the galaxy, not because they couldn't fight, but because they fought in ways that broke the minds of civilized species. Her hands shaking, Hiron began copying the most relevant documents to her personal storage device. Her friends needed to see this. Their presentation was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and they were planning to mock humans as incompetent failures. The truth was so much worse than they had imagined. She gathered her materials and rushed back toward the dormitory. They had to cancel their presentation. They had to warn Professor Veltar that they had discovered the truth. Most importantly, they had to understand what it meant that the galaxy had produced a species so effective at warfare that they had to be hidden away like a terrible secret dot. As she ran through the academy corridors, one phrase from the medical reports echoed in her mind: request immediate recall of human forces before total enemy psychological collapse. Her friends were about to learn that humans hadn't been banned for losing wars. They had been banned because they couldn't stop winning them in ways that destroyed the sanity of everyone who witnessed their methods. The presentation they had planned would have been the worst mistake of their academic careers. Instead, they were about to discover why some knowledge was too dangerous for young minds to handle without proper preparation. Tomorrow would change everything they thought they knew about strength, warfare, and what it meant. Hiron burst into their shared study room where Jiwon, Minho, and Daeho were putting the finishing touches on their presentation. Charts and graphs covered every available surface, all carefully designed to show human military incompetence. The irony would have been funny if Hiron hadn't just spent hours discovering how wrong they all were. "We need to cancel the presentation," she said breathlessly, her silver hair disheveled from running across campus. "We're wrong about everything, completely, terrifyingly wrong." Jiwon looked up from her holographic display with annoyance. "What are you talking about? We've spent weeks on this research. Our evidence is solid." "No, it isn't," Hiron insisted, pulling out her datapad with shaking hands. "I accessed the medical databases. The real casualty reports, the psychological evaluations, the classified sections we couldn't read before. The humans weren't banned for being incompetent. They were banned for being too effective." Minho laughed, his bone ridges catching the light as he shook his head. "Too effective? Hiron, we have documentation from dozens of sources saying exactly the opposite. Your xenopsychology classes are making you overthink simple facts." "Listen to me," Hiron pleaded, scrolling through the documents on her pad. At Kepler Station, 847 humans faced over 45,000 enemy soldiers. The humans lost 23 soldiers. The enemy lost 18,000. That's not incompetence. That's something else entirely. Daeho's rocky skin stopped sparking as he processed the numbers. That can't be right. No military force has casualty ratios like that unless they're fighting primitive creatures with sticks and stones. The enemy forces had standard galactic military equipment, Hiron said quietly. Ships, energy weapons, orbital support, everything, but they still lost at a rate of almost 800 to 1 against human forces. Jiwon frowned, her analytical mind struggling with information that contradicted weeks of research. Even if those numbers are correct, it could be explained by the humans staying in defensive positions while Allied forces did the real fighting. "No," Hiron said, pulling up more documents. "Listen to this psychological evaluation of a Ridiculed survivor. Patient reports that human soldiers continued advancing under direct artillery fire, using destroyed equipment as cover, showing no signs of fear or retreat instinct. Patient claims to have seen humans fighting hand-to-hand with enemy forces, twice their size, laughing during combat. The room fell silent. Minho was the first to speak, his warrior's instincts telling him something important was happening. Laughing during combat? That's not normal behavior for any species I know. There's more, Hiren continued, her voice barely above a whisper. A Centauri medic reported treating humans who continued fighting with injuries that should have killed them. A Corallian commander requested immediate withdrawal of human forces because his own troops were becoming psychologically disturbed just from watching humans fight. Deho's engineering mind began working through the implications. If humans were really that effective, why would anyone complain about them? Effective allies are valuable. Because, Hiren said, reading from another report, the psychological impact on allied forces was almost as severe as on enemy forces. Multiple species reported that their soldiers required therapy after working with human units. The humans fought in ways that civilized species couldn't understand or accept. Juan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Her blue skin had paled to an almost white shade. This doesn't make sense. If humans were such effective warriors, where are they now? Why don't we see human military officers at the academy? Why aren't they leading galactic defense forces? Because they were banned, Hiren said simply. Not for being incompetent, but for being too competent. The council didn't want to humiliate humans. They wanted to protect every other species from having to face what humans are capable of in war. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everything they had believed, everything they had researched, everything they had prepared to present to their class was not just wrong but catastrophically backwards. Minho sat down heavily, his warrior's pride struggling with the revelation. My people's archives? The reports about humans being unreliable and dangerous to work with, they weren't talking about incompetence. They were talking about humans being too good at killing, Hiren confirmed. So good that it broke the minds of soldiers from warrior. Species like yours who thought they understood what warfare meant. Deho's sparks had completely stopped, leaving his rocky form dim and still. The technical reports about their primitive weapons, the ones that called them unsuitable for civilized warfare, caused more psychological trauma than energy weapons, Hiren read from her pad. The physical nature of human weapons terrified enemy forces in ways that clean energy weapons didn't. Several species reported panic attacks just from hearing human gunfire. The weight of their mistake was becoming clear. They had planned to stand in front of their class and mock humans as military failures. Instead, they had stumbled onto one of the most carefully guarded secrets in galactic history. We need to see the footage, Juwan said suddenly, her scientific mind demanding concrete evidence. There has to be battle footage from these conflicts. We need to see what really happened. Hiren shook her head. It's all classified. Faculty access only, stored in the restricted historical archive. The warning labels alone would make most people stay away. What kind of warning labels? Minho asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Psychological hazard warnings. Content advisories about material that could cause trauma in viewers. Some files are marked for viewing only by senior military historians and council members. The room fell quiet again as they all contemplated what kind of military footage would require psychological hazard warnings. In their years at the academy, they had seen battles from dozens of conflicts involving various species. None had required special warnings. I'm going to see that footage, Hiren said quietly. Tonight, before our presentation tomorrow. I have xenopsychology access credentials. I can get into the restricted archives. That's against academy regulations, Juwan protested. If you're caught accessing classified material without authorization, you could be expelled. If we give our presentation tomorrow without knowing the truth, we'll be expelled anyway, Hiren replied. Once Professor Veltar realizes how badly we've misunderstood the situation, our academic careers will be over. Deho's form began sparking. Again, but weakly. Maybe we should just cancel the presentation and choose a different topic. We still have time. No, Minho said firmly, his warrior's honor asserting itself. If we've made this big a mistake, we need to understand how and why. Hiren is right. We need to see what really happened in those conflicts. That evening, after the academy's corridors had emptied and most students had returned to their dormitories, Hiren made her way to the restricted historical archive. The building was older than the main library, built during the early days of the Galactic Council when information was considered more dangerous and valuable. Her xenopsychology credentials got her through the first security checkpoint, but the deeper archives required additional clearance. She used her academic access codes, hoping that her research into human psychology would justify her presence if anyone questioned her later. The restricted section was eerily quiet. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows between rows of secure data storage units. Warning signs in multiple languages covered the walls, reminding visitors about the psychological dangers of certain historical materials. She found the section marked combat footage, psychological hazard warning, faculty access only, and felt her heart racing. The storage unit contained 3 crystalline data cores, each labeled with one of the human conflicts they had been researching. The Kepler Station incident, the asteroid belt campaign, the last stand at Proxima Gate. Each core had additional warnings. Viewer discretion advised. Content may cause psychological distress. Not recommended for viewing by non-faculty personnel. Therapeutic support may be required after viewing. Hiren connected her datapad to the first core, her hands trembling as she initiated the download. The file was enormous, suggesting hours of high-definition combat footage. As the transfer completed, she realized she was about to see something that had been hidden from student eyes for good reason. She disconnected the core and gathered her equipment, knowing that what she was about to show her friends would change their understanding of humans, warfare, and themselves forever. The footage contained the truth about why humans had been banned from combat, and why that ban was not punishment but mercy. As she left the archive, Hiren wondered if some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. In a few hours she would learn that the answer was yes. But by then it would be too late to forget what they were about to see. The real human military capability was about to be revealed to 4 young students who thought they understood what strength meant. They were about to discover that in a galaxy of civilized species, humans remained something far more primitive and terrifying than anyone wanted to admit. Hiren returned to their study room at 3 a.m, her face pale and her hands shaking. The stolen footage was stored on her personal datapad, 3 files that contained the most disturbing military documentation any of them would ever see. Her friends were waiting for her, unable to sleep after their earlier conversation about the true nature of human military capability. Did you get it? Jiwon asked quietly, noting the haunted expression on Hiren's face. Yes, Hiren whispered, holding up her datapad. But I want you to know that I only watched the first few minutes of the Kepler Station footage. What I saw made me physically sick. The warning labels weren't exaggerating. Minho straightened in his chair, his warrior's instincts telling him that something significant was about to happen. What did you see? Humans fighting, Hiren said simply. Really fighting. Not the way civilized species fight wars with strategy and technology and rules. The way predators fight when they're backed into a corner and have nothing left to lose. Deho's rocky skin began sparking nervously. Show us. We need to see what we've been missing. Hiren connected her datapad to the room's main display screen. The large holographic projector filled most of the wall, capable of showing footage in perfect detail. She selected the first file, titled The Kepler Station Incident, Complete Combat Record Warning, Graphic Content. The footage began with a standard military briefing display. Text scrolled across the screen showing the tactical situation. Kepler Station, a civilian evacuation point in disputed space under attack by a coalition of 3 hostile species. Defending forces included 847 human marines and 2,400 allied troops from various galactic military units. The humans were supposed to be support personnel, Hiram explained as the tactical display showed unit positions. They were there to help with civilian evacuation while the real military forces held defensive positions. The footage switched to actual combat cameras, and immediately the students understood why psychological warnings were necessary. What they saw was not warfare as they understood it. It was something far more primitive and terrifying. Human soldiers moved through the battlefield with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for bipedal creatures. When enemy fire forced them to take cover, they didn't retreat or call for backup. Instead, they advanced, using destroyed equipment and fallen debris as shields, constantly moving forward even under direct artillery bombardment. "They should be retreating," Minho said, his voice strained. "Those positions are completely exposed. Any rational military force would fall back and regroup. But the humans on screen weren't retreating, they were laughing." The audio picked up human voices calling out jokes and encouragement to each other as energy weapons exploded around them. When one soldier was hit by enemy fire and fell, his companions didn't stop to help him. They stepped over his body and kept advancing, while he struggled to his feet and followed them, still firing his weapon despite wounds that should have been incapacitating. G1 watched in horrified fascination as a human soldier ran out of ammunition for his energy weapon, then pulled out what appeared to be a primitive chemical explosive device. Instead of using it defensively, he charged directly at an enemy position, detonating the device at close range and taking out an entire squad of hostile forces along with himself. "That's not tactics," she whispered. "That's suicide." "Keep watching," Hiram said grimly. The footage continued, showing scene after scene of human soldiers displaying behavior that defied everything the students had learned about military doctrine. They saw humans using their own bodies as shields to protect wounded allies. They watched human medics continue treating patients while under direct fire, ignoring their own safety completely. They observed human engineers repairing critical equipment while battle raged around them, as if the explosions and gunfire were merely background noise. Most disturbing of all was the sound. Human voices filled the audio track, but instead of the fear, pain, and desperation that should accompany such carnage, the humans sounded almost cheerful. They called out tactical information with the casual tone of people discussing the weather. They made jokes about their wounds. When ammunition ran low, they switched to handheld weapons without any apparent concern. "Listen to them," Deho said, his sparks dim with shock. "They're enjoying this." The footage showed a human soldier engaged in hand-to-hand combat with an enemy warrior twice his size. The human was clearly losing, bleeding from multiple wounds, but he never stopped fighting. Even when thrown to the ground, he continued attacking, using teeth and fingernails when his weapons were knocked away. The enemy soldier, despite his physical advantages, seemed increasingly panicked by the human's refusal to acknowledge defeat. Eventually, the enemy warrior fled. "He ran away," Minho said in disbelief. "A superior fighter with better equipment ran away from a wounded human who should have been dead." The next sequence showed why. A group of human soldiers had been cut off from their main unit, surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces. Any civilized military unit would have surrendered at this point. Instead, the humans formed a defensive circle and began what could only be described as a war chant. The sound was unlike anything the students had ever heard. It wasn't the organized battle cry of a disciplined military force. It was something far more primal, a sound that seemed to come from some deep, ancient part of human psychology. As the chant grew louder, the human soldiers' behavior became even more disturbing. They stopped trying to preserve their own lives. They began taking risks that should have been impossible, charging enemy positions with complete disregard for survival. But somehow, impossibly, it worked. The enemy forces, despite vastly superior numbers, began to break and retreat. "The enemy is running away," Juwan observed, her voice barely audible. "They're abandoning prepared positions to get away from a handful of wounded humans." The footage continued for another hour, showing scene after scene of humans fighting in ways that violated every principle of civilized warfare. They saw human soldiers continuing to fight with injuries that would have killed most species. They watched humans coordinate complex tactical maneuvers while under extreme stress, as if pain and fear simply didn't affect their decision-making processes. Most horrifying was a sequence near the end of the battle. A human soldier had been severely wounded, his left arm completely severed by enemy fire. Instead of seeking medical attention, he picked up his severed arm and used it as a club to beat an enemy soldier unconscious, then continued fighting one-handed until the battle was over. When the Kepler station footage finally ended, the 4 students sat in stunned silence. What they had seen challenged their fundamental understanding of how intelligent species should behave in combat situations. "Show us the next one," Minho said quietly. Though his voice lacked its usual confidence, the asteroid belt campaign footage was even worse. It showed human pilots engaging in what could only be called kamikaze attacks, ramming their ships into enemy vessels when weapons failed. But unlike the desperate final acts of defeated forces, the human pilots seemed to coordinate these suicide attacks with casual professionalism, discussing family news and sharing jokes over the radio as they guided their ships into collision courses. "Listen to this," Hiron said, turning up the audio. A human pilot was talking to his squadron leader as his damaged ship approached an enemy cruiser. "Tell Sarah the kids were great at the school play last week," the pilot said cheerfully. "And, remind her that the mortgage payment is due on the 15th. "Will do, Mike," came the reply. "See you on the other side?" "Wouldn't miss it," the pilot responded. Just before his ship slammed into the enemy vessel at full speed, the casual tone of the conversation, as if dying in combat was just another routine task, disturbed the students more than any amount of screaming or heroic speeches would have. The last stand at Proxima Gate was the worst of all. It showed human soldiers who had been fighting continuously for 72 hours without sleep, many with severe injuries, holding a strategic position against overwhelming odds. Their behavior had become increasingly primal, yet somehow remained tactically sound. By the time all 3 recordings had finished, the students were completely silent. They had seen enough combat footage to understand why every species that encountered human forces had requested their immediate removal from battlefield operations. "Now you know," Hiron said quietly, "why humans were banned from combat. Not because they couldn't fight, but because they fought in ways that broke the minds of every civilized species who witnessed it." The next morning arrived too quickly. Jiwan, Minho, Hiron, and Deho sat in Professor Veltar's classroom, looking like they hadn't slept in days. Their presentation materials lay abandoned on their desks, charts and graphs about human military incompetence that now seemed like cruel jokes. Other students filled the room, chattering excitedly about their own projects, unaware that 4 of their classmates had just discovered one of the galaxy's most carefully guarded secrets. When Professor Veltar entered the classroom, his ancient eyes immediately found their group. He moved with his usual slow, measured steps, but something in his expression suggested he knew what had happened. "Good morning, class," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Today we begin student presentations on historical military disasters. First up, we have Jiwan's group presenting on the human combat ban." The 4 students exchanged glances. Jiwan stood slowly, her blue skin pale and her hands shaking slightly. "Professor," she said quietly, "we need to withdraw our presentation. We've discovered that our research was incomplete." Professor Veltar studied her face carefully, then nodded. "I see. Class, please continue working on your own presentations. Jiwan's group, please remain after class." The next hour passed in a blur of other students presenting their projects. The Vraxian Civil War, the collapse of the Meridian Alliance, the failed conquest of the Outer Rim territories. Each presentation followed familiar patterns of military overreach, poor planning, and predictable failure. Normal military disasters that made sense to civilized minds. When the classroom finally emptied, Professor Veltar approached their group. His ancient features were thoughtful, and his voice carried a weight that made them all pay attention. "You found the footage," he said. It wasn't a question. The four students nodded silently, unable to meet his eyes. Professor Veltar sighed deeply, the sound seeming to carry centuries of weariness. I was there, you know. At Proxima Gate, I was a young communications officer in the Zentari fleet, eager to prove myself in what we thought would be a simple defensive operation. He moved to the window, looking out at the Academy's peaceful grounds where students from dozens of species studied together in harmony. We had been fighting the enemy coalition for 3 days. Our forces were being systematically destroyed. The strategic position was hopeless. Then the human reinforcements arrived. Hiren found her voice first. What were they like? In person, I mean. Terrifying, Professor Veltar replied without hesitation. Not because of their appearance or their weapons. Because of their attitude. They looked at a battlefield where 3 major species were being defeated and saw it as just another day at work. He turned back to face them, his ancient eyes holding. Memories that were clearly still painful. I was monitoring communications during the battle. I heard human soldiers coordinating attacks while discussing their families, their hobbies, their plans for after the war. They treated warfare like any other job, something to be done efficiently and thoroughly before going home for dinner. Minho spoke up, his warrior's pride still struggling with what they had learned. But surely your people appreciated their effectiveness? Humans helped you win an impossible battle. Professor Veltar's expression grew darker. That's exactly the problem. We didn't just win. We dominated completely. The enemy forces didn't just retreat, they broke. Psychologically, permanently. Some enemy species never recovered from facing human forces. Entire military traditions were abandoned because soldiers refused to fight if there was any chance. Humans might be present. He walked to his desk and pulled out a thick sealed folder. This is the real reason for the human combat ban, not the sanitized version in your textbooks. What's in there? Deho asked, though his dim sparks suggested. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The psychological warfare assessment, Professor Veltar replied. The Council's secret evaluation of human military capabilities. It concludes that humans don't just fight wars, they become warfare itself. They show a capacity for violence and endurance that registers as supernatural to other species. He opened the folder and read from the first page. Quote, human forces demonstrate a psychological profile that appears to have no upper limit for tolerance of violence, pain, or personal risk. This creates a combat effectiveness that is not merely superior to other species but fundamentally different in nature. Humans appear to possess an evolutionary adaptation for persistence hunting that, when applied to warfare, results in behavior that civilized species cannot comprehend or psychologically process. Guan felt sick. Persistence. Hunting? Humans evolved on a deathworld, Professor Veltar explained. They are the descendants of predators who could chase prey for days without stopping, running their victims to exhaustion before moving in for the kill. This evolutionary background gives them mental and physical capabilities that seem impossible to species that evolved in more civilized environments. He continued reading from the assessment. Quote, the psychological impact of human combat methods extends beyond enemy forces to allied personnel. Multiple species report that their soldiers require extensive therapy after working alongside human units. The human approach to warfare violates fundamental assumptions about rational behavior during conflict situations. Hiren remembered the footage they had watched. The casual way human soldiers had discussed personal matters while engaged in life-or-death combat. They really were enjoying it, weren't they? Not enjoying, Professor Veltar corrected, but not suffering either. Humans seem to enter a psychological state during combat that allows them to function at peak efficiency regardless of circumstances. Pain, fear, exhaustion, these things affect their performance much less than they affect other species. He pulled out another document. This is from the final council debate about the combat ban. The deciding factor wasn't human casualties or tactical failures. It was the mental health crisis among non-human military personnel who had worked with human forces. Minho read over the professor's shoulder. 30% of Allied forces required psychiatric treatment after joint operations with human units. 15% were permanently unfit for military service due to psychological trauma. The trauma wasn't from seeing humans die, Professor Veltar clarified. It was from seeing humans refuse to die, from watching them continue fighting with injuries that should have been fatal, showing no signs of fear or pain, treating impossible situations as routine challenges. Deho's form had stopped sparking entirely. So the ban was to protect other species from being traumatized by human methods. Partly, Professor Veltar agreed, but also to prevent humans from completely destabilizing galactic military culture. If other species had tried to match human combat effectiveness, it would have led to wars of mutual annihilation. He showed them the final page of the assessment. The Council's conclusion was that humans represent a unique form of military capability that cannot be integrated into civilized warfare. They are simultaneously the most effective warriors the galaxy has ever seen and the most dangerous allies anyone could have. What happened to them? Hiron asked quietly. The human soldiers, I mean. They returned to Earth, Professor Veltar replied. The ones you meet here at the Academy are all from the diplomatic corps, carefully selected individuals who represent humanity's other face, their capacity for cooperation, creativity, and peace. The warriors remain on their homeworld, training for the day when the galaxy might need to lift the ban. Jiwan felt a chill run down her spine. You mean they're still there? Still preparing for war? The galaxy is not always peaceful, Professor, Veltar said gravely. There are threats beyond our current borders, forces that might someday require the kind of response that only humans can provide. When that day comes, the combat ban will be quietly lifted and human forces will once again take the field. He closed the folder and looked at each student in turn. This is why some knowledge requires maturity to understand. You came here planning to mock humans as military failures. Instead, you've learned that they are so successful at warfare that they had to be hidden away to preserve the sanity of civilized species. The students sat in silence, processing the full implications of what they had discovered. Their understanding of humans, warfare, and strength itself had been completely shattered and rebuilt in the span of a few days. What do we do now? Minho asked, his warrior's pride humbled by the realization that his people's military traditions were nothing compared to human capabilities. You learn, Professor Veltar replied. You study. You grow wise enough to understand that true strength is not just the ability to fight, but the wisdom to know when fighting is necessary. Humans possess both qualities, which makes them both the galaxy's greatest protectors and its most terrifying threat. Hiron raised her hand tentatively. Professor, could we change our major focus to study humans more directly? Professor Veltar smiled, the first genuine smile they had seen from him all semester. I was hoping you would ask. The Human Studies program needs bright minds who understand the complexity of human nature. But be warned, the more you learn about humans, the more you'll realize how little any of us truly understand them. As the students gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Professor Veltar